Imagine how terrific it would feel taking a hot shower after a cold, rainy day sailing. Now that's a good argument to add a water heater to your boat. In this video, I'll be doing a new install of an Isotemp Slimline 4-gallon water heater on our 1979 Pacific Seacraft Orion 27. This heater uses both engine coolant for heat as well as a 110 AC element. I'll be turning this space in the lazarette locker you see on the upper left into this one on the lower right. Since the water heater is higher than the engine, I'll have to include a top-off tank, and I'll have to relocate the engine coolant overflow tank with it. So in this video, I'll go through planning where to put a water heater, building a self-draining platform for it to catch water heater leaks or plumbing leaks, and then hooking up AC power, connecting plumbing, and finally connecting to the engine coolant system. So here's our boat, a 1979 Pacific Seacraft Orion 27 sailboat. It's 27 feet length on deck and about 9'3" on the beam. And at one time it looks like our boat had a water heater and it was crammed into the busy space behind the engine. We'll be going up here to the lazarette locker for this install, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So now a water heater is going back on board, but where to put it? Since the heater needs to be close to the engine to keep the coolant line short as possible, and this is a small boat, there aren't many options, even for a small water heater. And the 4-gallon tank I chose is close to the smallest water heater I could find, whether cylindrical or rectangular. And besides, a smaller tank probably wouldn't be sufficient for a shower of 1 or maybe 2 people. The 4-gallon Isotemp Slimline heater is about 20 inches long and 12 inches in diameter, very close to the size of the white bucket you see here behind the engine. This location behind the engine would keep the lines short, and it would also be below the fill cap of the engine's coolant system, so a top-off tank wouldn't be needed. And finally, another advantage, it would keep the added weight centered and low. So this is about where there seems to have been a water heater back in the day, but I think this would really limit engine access. So here on the ship schematic I have 4 brown boxes which are potential locations to house a water heater. The location in the midship area of the starboard closet, which some people chose for a water heater location, is far from the engine, and that might be fine for a 110 AC element to heat the water, but not for engine coolant. It's too long of a line. Anyway, the other location I see is possible in the port side quarter berth, but that's difficult to access to check on leaks, and it would also make it really messy to try to fill a top-off tank that would be required alongside of it. So I decided to go with the space on top of the built-in fuel tank in the lazarette locker on the starboard side of the boat. The downside of this location is that I'll be adding about 50 pounds of weight on the starboard side. I'm not sure if that'll affect the balance of the boat much, but items I store in the port side of the boat in the quarter berth will probably offset this a bit. First, I had to clear out a tray holding a couple of house batteries and a 6-pound propane tank used for the oven and range. That's a really bad combination to have an enclosed space. And the tray that housed them, without an air gap underneath the tray on top of the aluminum tank lid, allowed water and salts to corrode the tank lid. So after clearing this space, I replaced the fuel tank lid with a new one, cleaned the sediment and sludge off the tank walls, and I added a circular access panel to enable me to clean the tank if needed, right there in the middle of the lid. The propane tank is now on the stern rail. Next, you see here a dry fit of my plan. The water heater is partially concealed on the far upper right. It's pretty close to the engine, so I'll only need about 4 feet of coolant line, but the problem with this location is that it's above the engine, and that means I'll need to attach a small coolant top-off tank near the heater, and I'll need to replace the current cap on the heat exchanger on the Yanmar diesel 2GM20F with a 30 psi cap. The top-off tank will get a 16 psi cap. And finally, I'll need to relocate the overflow tank next to the top-off tank. There is just enough clearance to get coolant lines up from the engine between bulkheads under the instrument panel and over to the water heater. So the next thing to do was design a mount to secure the water heater to the boat, along with co-locating a top-off tank and expansion tank with it. And since I was locating above the fuel tank lid, I decided to build an aluminum mount with a self-draining plastic tray to catch drips. I welded aluminum L-bar for the frame. After cutting out all the pieces for the plastic trays going under the heater and under the top-off and overflow tanks, it was time to weld those. This is a welding rod, if you will, that comes out of the scrap that I have. I'll be welding along these seams right here to make a waterproof tray. And I'll be swapping out the broad heat tip here with this tip made for welding into corners. So I'm going to start off with a setting here on the end of about 5. I sanded and used a rasp to flatten uneven welds, then used a broad fitting tip on the welder to heat smooth the surface. Next, I installed an outdoor AC outlet behind the water heater and ran a 3-conductor marine grade 16 gauge wire from it to a new breaker on the AC panel. But after digging into that, it looks like I'll have another project ahead of me, and that's installing a new DC and AC panel and connectors. Back to the water heater. Because this is a tight fit, I made many trips between my shop and the boat to check on my work with tray in hand. Water tank, hot water tank. That's a tight fit. When we get in here, I pre-drilled into the bulkhead surrounding the fuel tank and used 8 screws to secure the tray with the 1/4 inch thick plastic spacers underneath the tray and above the tank. And since the screws are stainless and the tray is aluminum, I coated the screws with Lanacoat. Finally, it's time to mount the water heater and the other hardware. Anyway, finally got this thing in. Looks good and solid. All right, now to get out of here. Well, got cut on something. That's the fill, this is the overflow tank. Once I get my sender connected here with these wires, I'll install this little overhang which both protects that sender and gives me a little extra storage space here. I then mapped out where to run. And starting with the water supply lines, they need to go through the bulkhead behind the engine. I wanted them to be held in place for stress relief on the water heater connections and keep water and other fluids from dripping into the cabin. I'm using a 3/4 inch pipe threader here, tap, and I'm going to go in after this and put in a little bit of epoxy to seal up the plywood. This is going through gel coat, then plywood, and then I'll thread in these little collars here. Well, I use them as collars, but they're adapters. Fairly tight fit here. Probably put just a dab of silicone on here to just seal it. Consulting the service manual for my Yanmar 2GM20F engine, I've identified where to attach the coolant hoses from the water pump to the water heater. I then drain the coolant from the engine since it needs changing anyway. So to let the fluid out, first thing I got to do is release the cap here, top of the engine. And then over here to the side are two little thumb screw valves that I need to release. There's one up top, and then there's one you can't quite see that's right next to the lift pump. So I'll release those valves, and we should see some liquid falling out here into the pan under the engine, drip pan. All right, next step here is to install fittings, hose fittings on the input and output from the water pump here. And these are 3/8 NTP. Interesting, it's on a Japanese built engine, but anyway, so it is. And looks like to get this fitting in, I'm going to have to remove this piece of hose here. And on this guy, I had to go to Ace and buy some parts so I can extend the fittings out enough so that I can turn my fittings into place here. Anyway, that's what's up next. Just enough clearance here to get past the alternator. All right, gotta test this out now. All these new plumbing parts going out, coming in. Hopefully there are no leaks. All right, that completes this install of an IsoTemp 4-gallon slimline water heater. And just to recap what we have here, this is the water, hot water coming out, and cold water coming in from the plumbing system. And then down here, the coolant lines from the engine on either side. And then, in case there's a leak from the water heater, these black lines are tubing 3/8 that run down to the bilge. And I put two in here, one on either side of this tray, depending upon how this boat is tilting for a tack, for instance. There is enough space under here so I can access bolts that hold the feet down. And that's for 7/16 bolts, 4 of them to hold down the feet of that water heater. So this water heater can be isolated from the coolant system of the engine with these ball valves on either side here. And similarly for the plumbing system, these 2 ball valves here. That way, if the tank develops a problem and I have to remove it, I can still have my plumbing system will work, and my engine, I can still run it. So since this engine is below us by about 1.5 feet, I need top-off tanks, or a top-off tank. So this is my quart-size overfill tank here, or top-off tank. Has a 15 psi cap on it. On the engine, there's a 35. And then this also is outfitted with a little temperature dial so I can monitor coolant temperature. The tank is actually bypassed on this coolant line because it's teed off. So I can fill this tank. It doesn't get a continuous flow through it. And then finally, if there is a overpressure and coolant needs to be relieved, they'll go into this overfill tank, which is pretty typical on engines. And finally, the lines from the water heater go down through a bulkhead here to join the plumbing system. So I have a tray back here. As I mentioned, a drip tray for the water heater, and then one out here in case there spills from coolant when I'm filling. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this video and found some useful tips in your project in locating a water heater and plumbing it on your boat. My next project is building a battery box and locating house batteries, start batteries, and fuse box all in a convenient or organized location. And there'll also be posting a sale on a Pearson 365 catch out on the Chesapeake. So, good luck on your work. We'll see you next time.